Hey there, guys. Here's chapter 2 of The Game of Silence by Louise Erdrich. Words, words, words. Pressing up from her stomach, trembling on her lips. Words buzzing in her throat like caught bees. Banging in her head, harsh words, angry words, sounds boiling up in her like sap, wild things she couldn't let out. Yow! A kick from her brother almost caused Omakayas to blurt an exclamation. No. Omakaya sealed her lips together in a firm line and glared at her brother with all of the force pent up inside. If the fire from her eyes could scorch him, Pinch would be the first to yell out. Then he would lose the game of silence. But Pinch was used to receiving furious looks from his family. He knew just how to respond. First, he looked innocently at Omakayas as though he was ever innocent. He pretended he was unaware of the raging energy stuffed up inside of his sister. Then, as Omakayas bored her eyes at him with increasing intensity, he lolled out his tongue and twisted his face into a deranged and awful mask. His features shifted into one ugly and absurd face after the next, until suddenly Omakayas just about, almost, laughed. Just in time, she clapped her hand to her mouth, closed her eyes, concentrated. Yes, Ea. She would be a stone. Asanig. A pile of stones, each one harder and quieter than the next. She would be silent, and more silent yet. And in spite of her annoying brother, she would win. She kept her eyes closed, put her forehead on her knees. Thought stone, stone, stone. Asin, asin. Filled her mind with the sound of falling rain, which was easy. Outside it was not just raining, but pouring down a drenching, cold, miserable early summer shower. The rain had lasted for days since the Raggedy Ones had arrived. That was another thing. Besides a pinch, Omakayas couldn't stand rain anymore. The water made mush of tender new ground around her family's birch bark house. Droplets hissed through the roof vent into the fire, driving stinging smoke into her eyes. Everyone around her was affected. Nokomis's old bones ached, and she creaked like a tree every time she moved. The watery wind sent coughs racking through her mother's chest. It was too wet to play outside and cold when it should have been warm. Worst of all, Omakayas was stuck with Pinch. He nudged her. Omakayas almost slugged him in return, but controlled herself. She'd had enough of him to last her whole life. She opened her eyes a fraction, then her eyes went wide in shock. Somehow Pinch had gotten hold of her beloved doll, and he was making it teeter on the cliff of his knees. Omakayas bit her lip so hard it hurt. Pinch walked her doll to the edge of his knees, then teasingly back. If only Mama were here! If only she would return! Nokomis concentrated on her work so hard it was impossible to distract her. Here they are sitting together. Omakayas pretended to shut her eyes again, but cleverly watched until just the right moment to snatch back her doll. She sighed as though she was falling asleep, and then, with a flash, she grabbed. Taken by surprise, Pinch couldn't react quickly enough to hold on, and Omakayas triumphantly clutched her doll. She stuck it down the neck of her dress. There, safe. Inside she laughed, but she didn't make a single sound, not a chirp, not so much as a mouse's squeak. She was going to win the game of silence, and she knew it. Pinch was now poking little twigs into the fire in the center fire pit, watching them burn. Omakayas tried not to notice him, but his head was so big and fuzzy. Pinch's hair sprang out with its own energy. Crafty eyes in his tough round face calculated his sister's endurance. He was surely kicking up some mischief. Sure enough, Pinch drew the burning wand from the fire and laid it innocently next to her ankle, as though she didn't know that it would scorch her if she moved the slightest inch, and make her cry out first and instantly lose the game. She kicked it back at him. Gigo, Pinch, she nearly warned, but bit her lip. Yeah, he mouthed the taunt, making an impossibly irritating face that almost broke Omakayas' discipline. Luckily, just at the second that Omakayas decided to forfeit the game and to smash her little brother over the head with the big tin soup ladle, the visitors arrived. They are here, said her grandmother. You can quit the game until after we eat. Ugh! Omakayas exploded with such a wild sound of rage that Nokomis jumped. Pinch retreated, unnerved by how sorely he tested his sister. Omakayas breathed out in relief. These visitors were her friends and cousins, Twilight, Little Bee, and Two Strike Girl. They had brought the boy she called, in her mind, the Angry One. Her cousins were her favorite friends, the ones she counted on. Twilight was much like her name, quiet and thoughtful. Little Bee was funny and bold. Two Strike was tough, and she could do anything a boy could do, usually better. Since her mother had died, she was wilder than ever. Even her father had not been able to handle Two Strike and had left her with Auntie Muskrat. But Auntie Muskrat had had no success in taming Two Strike. Sometimes she was so fierce that she outdid everyone. It was a challenge to play with her. The girls had learned to sew and bead together, gathered berries, and helped their mothers clean fish. They also learned early on how to tan hides, a task that Omakayas despised. And now, too, her sister Angeline was home. Omakayas grinned with satisfaction. Pinch was delightfully outnumbered by girls and would pout, creeping to Mama's side when she arrived and turning into a baby, hoping to be pampered with tidbits of meat and maple sugar. Now everyone, the children and their parents, squeezed into the lodge. They had made the lodge extra big that summer for visitors. For the first time, it was packed entirely full, but there was enough room for everyone. Even the Angry One found a space to sit. He glared from a little spot against the wall. Together they ate rich venison soup from the shallow birch bark makakun they had brought with them. Two other men squeezed in, important men. Old Tallow entered, huge and rangy and smelling of wolf. She settled herself while outside her ferocious dogs stood guard, unmoving and alert even in the pelting rain. Each of Old Tallow's feet seemed to take up as much space as a small child, but Omakayas didn't mind. Warily but completely, she loved the fierce old woman. Each visitor brought a gift for the pile that the children who won the game of silence would choose from that night. For it was an important night. With the Raggedy Ones came serious doings, difficult questions, and impossible news. Great attention was needed. The grown-ups needed to counsel, think, absorb the facts without having to shush small children. The children could tell how important the meeting was from the degree to which their silence was required. The pile of treats was the best ever. There was a bag of marbles, some of actual glass, not just clay. A pair of narrow makazinan that Omakayas thought just might fit her. One doll, elaborately dressed in a tiny set of breeches and a leather coat. A sharp knife. A deer knuckle game. 2 duck's bills of maple sugar tied together with a split jack pine root. 6 red ribbons, a little roll of flowered cloth, 8 tiny bells, 1 small bow, and 6 arrows tipped with real brass points cut from a trade kettle. The arrows were fletched with the sharp black and yellow feathers of a bird that the island where they lived was named for, the golden-breasted woodpecker. Old Tallow must have brought them. What treasures! The children examined them breathlessly, each picking out one particular prize they meant to win. Little Bee, of course, wanted the doll. Two Strike Girl, the bow and arrows. Pinch coveted the knife, but he was torn by greed for the maple sugar and the need for marbles to replace those he'd lost. The Angry One did not deign to move from his spot or look at the gifts. No doubt he'd have no problem winning the game. As for Twilight, quiet and serene, she had no trouble playing the game and would be content with anything. Omakayas wanted the ribbons, the bells, and the marbles too, but she settled on the makazinan because she had watched her grandmother make them so carefully. They were fancy with velvet ankle cuffs, the tops beaded with flowers and little white sparkling vines, worth her silence. And there the makazinan. Now the grown-ups were ready to start talking. Nakoma sang the song of the Game of Silence 4 times, nearly catching Pinch at the end. Then she turned away from them too, absorbed in the talk. Omakayas looked longingly at Twilight, and her cousin made a sad and frustrated face. With her favorite cousin so close and her annoying brother so near, it was difficult to play. If only they could talk. At first, the girls communicated by mouthing words and moving their eyes, but the temptation to laugh was too great. They turned away from each other unwillingly. Omakayas listened to the rain, a solid drumming and hissing. Then she listened to the fire crackling and sighing. She watched the beautiful and changing glow of the coals. At some point, Omakayas couldn't tell exactly when. Her attention was caught by something her father said. And then she noticed that her cousin Twilight was also listening to the grown-ups' conversation. Soon, they all couldn't help but listen. They leaned forward, straining to hear every sound, almost forgetting to breathe. That night, for the first time, everybody got their prizes. nobody lost the game of silence. For that night they knew the threat of a much bigger loss. They would all fear to lose something huge, something so important that they never even knew that they had it in the first place. Who questions the earth, the ground beneath your feet? They had always accepted it, always here, always solid. That something was home. Omakayas' father, Mikwam, touched his heart and spoke with a troubled frown. "We do not use the black marks of the Chimukamanag," he said, "because we keep the record here." The Chimukamanag were the white people. The black marks that Mikwam spoke of were the writing that Angeline learned day by day at the mission school in the town of La Pointe. The writing was very strange to Omakayas. Black marks that captured sounds, tracks across paper or slate birds or birch bark that stood for words spoken. How did the odd scratching connect to the sounds? All a mysterious business, and one that her father, anyway, did not trust. The Ojibwe relied on memory. They repeated stories, songs, the words to promises and treaties. Everyone memorized all that was important. Although people scratched elaborate signs on birch bark and rolled them into scrolls, they relied on memory to go with the marks. Memory was Ojibwe writing. Things were not forgotten that way. Something about the black marks had gone wrong. Omakayas knew that. The black marks promised one thing, but the Chimukamanag wanted to break that promise. "We signed a paper that said they could take the trees. We signed a paper that said they could take the copper from the earth," said the old chief Bijiki, disturbed. "We didn't say they could take the earth." "Who can take the earth?" Fishtail spoke, gesturing with his strong and eloquent hands. He was a young man. He expressed his opinions well. The whole family liked Fishtail, but Angeline liked him best of all. She watched him shyly from beneath her long eyelashes. "I'll tell you," he answered himself, turning just a little toward Angeline as though she gave off a warming glow. "When the Chimukamanag opened the earth, they believe they own it, just like a kettle, just like this deerskin, just like this knife." The other men laughed, and the women put their hands to their faces, but it was a bitter laugh because everyone knew what he said was true. Here's what happened. The Ogama, or the president of all the Chimukamanag, had sent a message to the leaders of the Ojibwe. That message was simple. They must leave their homes. The Ogama said that the government now owned the ground they lived on. It was needed for white settlers. He had issued a removal order. He had decided that land payments would be given out in a new place in the west. But the western land was the home of the Bwanag. The raggedy ones had tried to live there, and look at what happened. "There was a time when we had no quarrel with the Bwanag," said Dede. "They lived in their part of the world, and we lived in ours. We even traded with them. But as the Chimukamanag pushed us, so we pushed the Bwanag. We are caught between two packs of wolves." "We can't go to the west," cried Albert Lepoitre. Lepoitre was comical, chubby, and sometimes cowardly. "Our enemies will kill us with knives," he cried. "They will shoot our brains out, club us in the kidneys, raise our scalp, burn us, cut us into little pieces." "Sa!" Nokomis silenced him. "You're scaring yourself." The children were riveted, staring in horror, each imagining some dreadful death. Pinch's eyes were the biggest, roundest 2 moons. Although he acted tough and always shouted fiercely when playing at imaginary battles, he was still a little boy. Now he crept closer to Yellow Kettle and bent his frowsy head to lean against her. Omakaya saw that he had taken a corner of Mama's skirt between his fingers, and he clung to it for reassurance. "Still, we must be brave," said Lepoitre. "The Chimukamanag owe us payment for the land they took. I intend to collect." He folded his arms over his round pumpkin of a stomach and tried to look determined and fearless. "Here is what I think," said a man named Cloud. "We have done something to offend. 1 or 2 of our hot-hearted brothers must have killed a Chimukaman." "Aye, Keget," said Mikwam slowly. "That is possible." Old Tallow reared herself up in the light. She wore her hat with a feather even in the lodge. Now she spoke in the abrupt snarl of a person used to giving, not ever taking, orders. "Perhaps we have broken our promise to be peaceful and treat them kindly. Send runners out. Send out our Michitweg. Find what our foolish brothers have done. Then we can punish the wrongdoers and stay here, right here." Beneath her words, there was a desperation that Omakayas had never heard before in Old Tallow's tough growl. The powerful woman was attached to her cabin, to her hunting territory, to the level patch of sand and the canopy where she and Omakayas' father constructed expertly balanced and seamless jimanan of the perfect bark found on this island. Old Tallow had never traveled far from her home in her life, and she was unwilling to start now. There's Old Tallow, their hat with the feather. Another friend of Miquam, the wise leader Buffalo, agreed that it was a good idea to find out who was responsible for the Chimukamanag change of heart. "Who will go?" he asked. Cloud answered that he would scout to the south. A swift young man said he would travel to the east. Fishtail said that he would travel to the west, and yet another man accepted responsibility of the north. They would meet at a place called Sandy Lake, then return to the island in 1 year. It was no surprise that Fishtail would leave, for 2 years ago he had lost his beloved wife. "After all, I have nothing," he began, by way of explaining his willingness to go on this dangerous mission. He was going to say he had no reason to stay on the island, but suddenly he stopped. His brow creased and he turned his head just a fraction, gazing with a surprised tenderness at the lovely, scarred face of Angeline. There was a long beat of silence between Angeline and Fishtail, though they were not playing the children's game. Perhaps, Omachaius thought later, when she understood the messages between the two that night, Fishtail might have stayed that year if only Angeline had made some gesture. But Angeline was too shy and uncertain to look at him. By the time she was able to meet his glance, he had committed himself to go on the dangerous journey into the land of the Bwanag. Albert would take other men too and investigate the promise of payments far off near a place called Sandy Lake. "I'll go too!" Two-Strike Girl jumped to her feet with a loud cry, then clapped her hand over her mouth. But she was forgiven her outburst by the men, by the kind leader Buffalo, and by Miquam, and by Omachaius' grandmother. "Ho-wah, brave-hearted girl," said Fishtail, smiling. And Two-Strike Girl sat down again, proud of the fire in her heart, wishing that she could fight. Omachaius couldn't help noticing that the angry one looked at Two-Strike with a combination of emotions. Annoyance? Admiration? Did he want to shout at Two-Strike, or did he want to fight alongside her? He caught Omachaius looking at him suddenly and looked down. His face was angrier than ever, but he also looked confused. The morning that the men left was ordinary, sunny, and calm. Yellow Kettle and Angeline packed dry meat, dried fish, a pair of leggings, and some tobacco for Fishtail. The girls walked down to the dock from which each of the Jimanan would embark. The other men were already gone. Fishtail was the last. There he stood, patiently. It looked like he was waiting. Maybe, thought Omachaius, someone else was coming. He was staring so intently in their direction that Omachaius looked behind them. But no, he was staring at Angeline. The two girls approached, and then, as they arrived, Omachaius couldn't help but notice that her sister's hand trembled as she gave the package of traveling provisions to Fishtail. Omachaius watched him intently when he took the pack from Angeline to see if his eyes would soften. Sure enough, she thought that she detected a certain question in his gaze. She kept watching him and then realized that both he and her sister were staring right at her. "Giwin," ordered Angeline in a sharp voice, "go home." Omachaius felt an instant pang of hurt and surprise. Her sister, so beautiful, hurt her feelings sometimes. Not as often now as she had before she'd suffered the sickness that scarred her cheeks, but often enough. Now was one of those times. Omachaius couldn't hide her shame. She glanced at Fishtail to say goodbye, but then saw that his eyes warmly praised her. He smiled his thanks. "Miigwech, little one," he said, then bent near to look straight into her eyes. He was not afraid, as some young men are, to be kind. At that moment, Omachaius loved him very much. "I will remember you when I'm far away in the land of the Bwanag. Don't be sad. I'll return by the time the earth warms again. And now, my little sister, will you leave me alone with your big sister for a moment? I must say goodbye to her, too." "You can say goodbye to her right now," said Omachaius. Stubborn, she held her ground. Fishtail smiled and shook his head so understandingly, however, that she couldn't refuse. For a moment before she left, he held her around the shoulders. She ran off smiling, proud that he was her friend. Then she slowed to a walk, and her heart thudded. Fishtail's travels would last until next year, by the time the earth warms again. Omachaius sat at some distance and watched her sister take leave of Fishtail. Nothing special happened, they just talked. Then Fishtail got into the center of the Jiman and lifted his paddle. With a broad, smooth movement, he was launched far past the dock. Once the Jiman was no more than a black smudge, tiny and almost invisible between the dark of the water and the trees of the far-off shore. Omachaius became restless. She tapped her toes in the sand, jumped up, sat down, waited, called her sister once or twice, but Angeline did not answer, nor did she move. Angeline continued to stand on shore, watching the place where Fishtail had disappeared. After the men had left, the camps were very quiet. Sounds seemed louder. There was leftover pot stew in pots and too much room in the lodges. Angeline was short of temper or too silent. Even Day Day, missing his good friend Fishtail, brooded. Every night he sat at the fire and stared into the flames without speaking or even making anything. To see his hands idle was strange. Maybe he wished he'd gone along to share the hardships and dangers. Maybe he was planning something that required much thought. It was a relief to Omakayas to get away, even if it meant sharing work with Nokomis. Every morning, Omakayas and Andeg visited grandmother's garden and helped the plants along. Day Day had found a piece of tough rootwood, and from it he'd fashioned a perfectly balanced short digging tool for Omakayas. A gnarled handle made it easy to grip, and the end, filed flat and sharpened, was good for chopping weeds. The sun beat down on Omakayas. First, her hair turned hot, then her shoulders. Sweat seeped down the sides of her face and then ran along her collarbone. Her eyes stung with salt and her arms ached. She was glad for Andeg's company. As she worked, he walked beside her or hopped in flapping bounds to peck up grubs and worms and beetles that her hoe unearthed. Sometimes he flew a short way off into the woods, and Omakayas heard him talking to other crows, but he always returned to her. His calls sounded like encouragement. "Yeah, yeah!" Nokomis' garden was very old. She had inherited it from her mother, who had inherited it from hers. The earth had grown rich from generations of careful replenishment. All around the edges of the garden, a stout fence of driftwood hung with cheerful rags of clothing, protected the earth and the tender plants. But the garden was more than the space it occupied. Its seeds, too, had been handed down for many generations. During the worst of the family's hunger 2 winters ago, Nokomis finally insisted that they eat half of her seed beans, but only because she'd saved extra. Nobody even thought of eating more. Nokomis' seeds, after all, were the future. While Nokomis piled beech weeds around the new shoots of beans and muttered to herself or the plants, Omakayas was never sure which, Andeg made a game of perching on one driftwood fence pole and then the next, as though trying each one out. Some made him critical. From others he cawed joyfully. Everything felt so right and familiar to Omakayas that the sudden thought that they could be removed from their home was a crash of impossibility. "They can't send us away, can they?" she asked Nokomis as they helped the pumpkin vines twine around the stalks of corn, which would shortly be tall. "They can't do anything, really, Nokomis, can they? There are so few Chimukumanag and so many of us." Nokomis leaned back, kneeling in the dirt. Omakayas was surprised that she had stopped her work. Almost nothing got Nokomis to stop once she started on her garden, but now her face was serious. "Listen, my little one," she said, "for I'm going to tell you the truth. The Chimukumanag that we see here are only the first drops of rain. A storm of them lives past the sunrise in the east. They can flood us like a river. Can we stop them? We have seen what happens to others when they resist, go to war. The river wipes them out. Our way is different. We have always found out how to live with them, work with them, trade with them, even to marry them." Nokomis' eyes fixed on Omakayas with amusement, and Omakayas smiled back. Day Day's grandfather had been a French trader, one of the first. Day Day had grown up in a house made of trees like the cabin he'd built for his family. This alone marked him as different. "I think Day Day is figuring out a plan," said Omakayas. "He is always staring at the fire, thinking hard." "I hope you're right," Nokomis said. Her look rested tenderly upon her granddaughter. "This is a good place, and I hope for you to grow up here and become a strong woman." "I love it here so much," Omakayas admitted. Suddenly her eyes grew hot, her chest tight. "It is right where my little brother rests." Nokomis patted her hand and smoothed Omakayas' hair back with gentle fingers. Omakayas leaned into her grandmother's arms, and for a long time the two sat in the garden on the sun-warmed earth, listening to the birds call and talk to one another unseen in the dense green of the woods. If they ever had to leave, Omakayas felt her heart might fall right out of her body to lie forever on the ground it loved. And that's the end of chapter 2. Thanks for listening.